And I am excited to have with us today Joyce Bender. Joyce is a friend and a mentor to so many in the disability rights movement, myself included. She is an international leader in the area of disability employment. Joyce is the founder and CEO of Bender Consulting Services, which provides disability employment expertise in such areas as recruitment, workplace mentoring, and digital accessibility. In 2018, Joyce founded the Bender Leadership Academy, a nonprofit focusing on preparing youth with disabilities to be successful in the workplace. She speaks across the United States and internationally, representing the State Department on information exchanges related to disability employment best practices. She has represented the State Department in programming with Panama, South Korea, Indonesia, Japan, Kazakhstan, and Tunisia. She is the vice chair of the American Association of People with Disabilities, a national cross-disability rights organization supporting full civil rights for the over 60 million Americans with disabilities by promoting equal opportunity, economic power, independent living, and political participation. She is also the host of Disability Matters, the longest running podcast on Voice America. She is obviously very busy and accomplished, and I'm so glad she's taken the time to be with us today to share her wisdom, insight, and passion on employment of people with disabilities and what churches and other faith communities can do to improve employment outcomes for people with disabilities. So Joyce, I just want to begin by saying welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Curtis. It is a true pleasure and honor to be here. I have to tell you, I was really excited about this opportunity. And before I say anything else, I must tell you, I have only the highest respect for Curtis. That is why when he called me, I said yes immediately. He is a disability rights leader, a man of God, committed to social justice, and I am just so blessed that he is a friend of mine. So, Curtis, thank you for giving me this great opportunity.
Well, thank you. We're going to talk about your work with Bender Consulting and the Leadership Academy, but I'd like to first discuss the context in which this conversation is happening. This is one in a series of justice dialogues hosted by the American Baptist Home Mission Societies. And employment of people with disabilities is very much a justice issue. Can you talk a little bit about the employment landscape in the United States for people with disabilities? What are the rates of employment for people with disabilities relative to those without disabilities?
Thank you. That's a great but a sad answer is coming. I know when I first had my accident in 1985, in 1986, 90% of people with disabilities, 90, were not counted in the workforce. Now here we are, 32 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed, and 70% are not counted in the workforce, with double the unemployment rate of those able-bodied. I always say with the ADA and, President Bush signing it, and my good friend that passed away, Attorney General Dick Thornburgh, enforcing it, we have so many things, curb cuts, braille on the elevators, captioning, housing, transportation, accessible. Can't ask someone, hey, what is your disability? We have all of these things, and yet the needle has not moved on employment. Why is that? So I guess we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah, I know Dick Thornburgh often spoke of employment as the unfulfilled promise of the ADA, the piece that we really haven't cracked. As you say, we've moved the needle on that, but we haven't really made the kind of strides that we made in terms of accessibility of, physical structures. Accessibility to the workplace is still an issue. And of course, that impacts, does it not, poverty rates that we see for people with disabilities relative to the general population.
Yeah, it is. I just was talking to Judy Human, who, of course, is one of the most well-known disability rights leaders in Berkeley, California, which is where the protest for Section 504 took place. And I asked, well, Judy first asked me, what do you think, why? Why do we have this problem with employment? Well, there's stigma, there's pity, but I told her there's also a new thing, because like, I cannot understand this. And so to me, when I say new thing, in my mind, a new thing, discounting disability. What I mean is there are things in life, whether it's prisons, where someone can walk right past the prison, never notice there's a prison. I don't think people are even seeing people with disabilities in their mind when they think about employment. I mean, that's terrible, because then we're not even to the pity part. But I don't think they're even seeing us, because how do we have this great resignation with everyone saying, I need people, right here in Pittsburgh, where I'm headquartered. I would go to events, but then also in DC, and I would hear people stand up saying, how are we going to find people? Where will we find people? We can't find people. And I always wanted to stand up and, wave my hands and say, here we are, we're here. You have this huge untapped labor force. And I thought, boy, that's sad. Now, don't get me wrong. The way after the pandemic, people could now work from home, that was an advantage for people with disabilities. But still, for what was going on, we have not made the progress we should have.
And it's interesting, is it not, that there's evidence that corporations that hire people with disabilities, employers that hire people with disabilities, they have better job retention of those individuals, greater loyalty, actually perform better than their peers in the marketplace. I mean, that to me is what is so frustrating, but also kind of fascinating, is that if you prioritize employment of people with disabilities, you're actually going to do better in the market as a corporation or employer.
Right, just to comment on that, my friend Ted Kennedy Jr., for years I've known Ted, and for years we would talk about, what do we have to do? I know, because I've done this for a living since 1995, with a for-profit company, to provide rich benefits and no pity. People with disabilities don't need pity, they need paychecks. But Ted finally said, we have all of this information, but it's our information. They're not going to believe us, meaning companies, until they see data. So he went to Accenture now. He went to Accenture and asked them, would you mind doing a study? See companies that hire people, companies that don't. Well, even Accenture was shocked when they saw that companies that hired people with disabilities were 2 times more profitable than those that did not. And there's a lot of other data that came out even about profitability, that if you go to Accenture.com, you can find that report. But now we have this data. Now what?
Yeah, where do we go? Where do we go from here? So to that point, tell me a little bit about yourself and how you came to found Bender Consulting Services. So I find this interesting as well. I mean, Bender Consulting Services is a for-profit company. The Leadership Academy is a nonprofit entity. So you're kind of working in these two worlds. But tell me a little bit about how you came to found Bender Consulting and what you do. What is the mission of Bender?
Well, as I was growing up, I had this off and on this unusual faint where I would faint and then I would be extremely sick. So, I grew up in a rural area and my parents thought it was because I had low blood pressure. Well, then as the years went on, this would happen to me, sometimes only once a year. And then they started thinking it was the flu. Different people told me it was the flu.
Hmm.
I even used to say to my husband, Bill, oh, I hope I don't get that flu again because, it's terrible. Well, off I go to the doctor when my husband found me one night unconscious and said, hey, my wife's passing out. She's unconscious. She's sick after. What's going on here? As a matter of fact, it started happening more. And my husband, Bill, would say, no, 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 don't do that thing. Of course, there was no control over that thing.
Hmm.
And in 1985, I went to see the movie Amadeus. And at the intermission, I went to get a soda, and my husband went to the men's room, and I had a seizure, and I hit the floor so hard. I fractured my skull, had an intracranial brain hemorrhage, broke the bones in my right inner ear, and ended up going to the hospital in a coma, having life-saving brain surgery. And against all odds, I had this miraculous recovery, other than I lost 70% of my hearing in my right ear from the fall. And when I come to and I'm in intensive care, oh my, I'm on anti-epilepsy medication. And then when I did have a seizure, it was exactly like those faints. People think, because I ultimately became the chair of the National Board of the Epilepsy Foundation, that people think when you have a seizure, you have a convulsion. But more people do not have a convulsion than do. And so, I do not, and I did not say that magic word. So, it was misdiagnosed. And what I did for a living was executive search in IT prior to Bender Consulting, which means my background has always been in employment. So I got back to work in a couple months, back to my search firm. And I was asked to go to community college to this 13-month program that would train people with disabilities to be COBOL developers. So off I go. They didn't ask me because of my disability. They asked me to teach them how to write a resume, how to interview. Well, I had no idea that this attitudinal barrier toward employing people with disabilities was so horrific. So when I saw it, no one would call, no one would interview anyone. I did volunteer work. And by the way, the chairman of the board was Vince Sarney, who was then the chairman of the board of PPG Industries. And I could not figure out how the heck did they get him to be the chair of the board. And it's because his wife was blind. It seems like there's always a something.
Mhm.
But I did volunteer work for like 9 years, and then that's it. Call it righteous indignation or whatever. I said, that's it. I know people with disabilities can do these jobs. So in 1995, I founded Bender, and the way I did it is I met with the CEO. At that time, it was called Blue Cross of Western Pennsylvania. Now it's Highmark. And actually, while Bill Lowry was the CEO, it became Highmark. Bill, I have this dream. I want to start a company focused on the employment of people with disabilities. Would I be able to get on contract at the company 6 students from that school and keep them on contract for 3 years? Now, just so you know, today, even today, if I would go to a company, hey, would you agree to bring on contract so I'll pay the salary I'll pay the benefits, you pay me an hourly rate. 6 people for 3 years, oh, I'd be here now. I've got to talk to procurement. I've got to talk to legal. I've got to talk to a million people they would think of. It took Bill one day to say yes. One day. And now I speak around the world for the State Department when a country requests an expert on the employment of people with disabilities. And when I'm in a country like Kazakhstan, I'll think he would never have believed it. What would happen from that one decision? That's why I always tell people, one man, one decision, your one decision, look what happened. So what we do, to answer your question, is the heart and soul of this company is employment. So we recruit and place people with disabilities, only people with disabilities, in IT, engineering, finance, procurement across the United States. We also have a division that handles digital accessibility, making sure websites are accessible. And we have a software product, iDisability, that trains companies how to work with and communicate to people with disabilities. But as I said, the heart and soul will always be employment. And Curtis, I want to tell you, because this relates to Dick Thornburg, I had 2 customers in the federal government for years. One of them was the National Security Agency. Here we have an intelligence agency that to work for them, you have to go through a 9-month security clearance, conditional job offer, and then a lifestyle polygraph test. So when Governor Thornburg was speaking at New York Law School, he said, you know, there's a company I really love in Pennsylvania, Bender Consulting Services, and they place people with disabilities at the NSA. So what's your excuse? What? They'll hire people, but you won't hire an entry-level accountant. So I'll never forget when he said that.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned your international work, consulting. What has been the responsiveness to that when you go to a place like Kazakhstan and you talk about employment of people? This how open, how receptive have those folks been?
We have to start with, across Asia, there is pervasive shame of having a disability. So when I go to these countries, I'm starting with, you have value. I mean, I'll hear people speak and they'll say, I don't have value, you know, I have a disability. So I have to start with, you do have value, you have great value. And I have to move from that to people with disabilities can work, which is why I also have to talk to like their Chamber of Commerce, universities. They're all behind the United States, but it's terrible because it's just epilepsy. We'll use it. When I went to South Korea, the first thing this epileptologist said to me before I spoke to this small group was, whatever you do, don't say the word epilepsy. Don't use that word. So I went up front and I said, hi, my name's Joyce Bender. I'm living with epilepsy and I'm not ashamed. So, you know, that's what happened. But yeah, there's pervasive shame. What has helped me the most is Richard Roberts, works for the State Department. He's a diplomat. I first met him when I went to South Korea. He was so impressed with what happened that then when I went to Japan, I went there with him, and I'll next year be going to Brazil. But my idea is working with the State Department, working with a US corporation in one of those countries, training someone from that country to do what I do, because obviously they want to work with someone from their own country, not an American. So that's what I'm working on now.
So I just want to pause for a moment and invite folks who are on the call. If you have questions, you can put those in the chat. We'll have a time for a Q&A at the close in just a few minutes. But if you have some initial questions you want to put in the chat, I'll take a look at those as well. So Joyce, October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, and it's still October, just barely, and it's never too late to raise that up and lift that up throughout the year. But it's an opportunity to recommit to improving access to employment for people with disabilities. What should religious congregations as employers be doing to expand access to employment for people with disabilities in their own communities?
Well, once again, I have to bring up the Thornburgs because I called Jenny Thornburg years ago and I said, I am so upset at our church that we do not have sign language interpreters. And she said, find a way, do something. So the something I did is when I would tithe, I would write where it says other sign language interpreters until they had so much tithes for me. I knew they would have to do it, which they did, but I'm going to use that as an example. Jesus welcomed everyone. He did not exclude anyone. All are welcome. But that's really not the way it really is in churches. There are churches that aren't accessible to someone in a wheelchair. There are churches where they don't have an accessible restroom, no sign language interpreters or cart, where you could see on a screen what is being said. So really there you're leaving out the entire deaf community and or people in wheelchairs. Now, Northway's done a great thing. We have a section of the church, autism. If you want to go to church, you really want to go, but your child has a big outbreak and you don't know how to deal with it, we have it all set up. But as I said, you've got to look at all forms of accessibility and welcome the disability community. And, when they celebrate, for example, talk about Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we should talk about the signing of the ADA Day, or National Disability. By the way, I am now refusing to call it National Disability Employment Awareness Month. I always say, hey, we've had more than enough awareness. Start hiring people, although you said the correct name. That is the name this month.
Right.
But you're really not welcoming the disability community if someone has to help, and I saw this, carry them up steps.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think some congregations may be accessible externally. They may meet the kind of code with ADA to get into the building, but then inside the building may be very inaccessible, whether it's the facilities or even within the sanctuary. I mean, I think about choir lofts that are not accessible, or even the podium area. So there's a lot of thinking, I think, that needs to go into what does it look like to create a inclusive environment for people with disabilities, and even worship styles. I mean, you mentioned autism. I think different stimuli in worship can have an effect on individuals with disabilities. So it really is a rethinking of how we do things.
I always say, why is that one place for a wheelchair in the back of the church?
Right.
Why? It could be in the front. Why is it always in the back? And then we had a young woman with a significant disability, and she went to church every Sunday, but she didn't get to take communion because no one thought to go over and open it for her. And she could not. See, it's things like that. It's like what you just said. When you get into the church, it's being welcomed and included in everything. And it's thinking about all these things. Now, I would suggest at your church, you ask for a diversity committee. That's what we're going to be doing at Northway, a diversity committee, so we can talk about what you need to do to be more accessible. That is one other suggestion I have.
I want to talk with you a little bit about mental health. There was a recent report from the Annie E. Casey Foundation regarding children in the United States who are struggling with mental health, experiencing unprecedented levels of anxiety and depression. And those are trends that are reflected in society more broadly. Your friend and colleague, Mary Brogger, was a mentor to youth and so many others in this work. Can you say a little bit about Mary and the Mary Brogger Mental Health Initiative?
Yeah, the worst thing that ever happened to me in my life is when Mary tragically was killed in a hiking accident. Although there was someone with her when it happened. And it's only because of the grace of God. I mean, I was bad for several months. Mary worked with me 22 years, traveled on vacation with us, with her husband. It used to be a big joke, don't they get enough of each other? But then she would be the one that traveled with me around the world. Best friend. I mean, it was terrible. And right when it happened, I said, you know what? I'm going to do something to honor Mary. And the something is Mary loved high school students with disabilities. She herself lived with clinical depression for 40 years. Hard to believe because she is so dynamic and so like a fireball that even the National Disability In National Organization gave her the Advocate of the Year award and is changing the name to the Mary Brogger Advocacy Award.
Yeah.
But I felt this would be a great way. So what I did, I'm on the National Board of Bazelon Center on Mental Health Law. And the thing that is the biggest problem is shame. Students with disabilities don't even want to tell their parents when they know something's different, something's wrong. So we have a national campaign going on right now. Just go to benderleadership.org. That's benderleadership.org. If you want to join, it's called #NotAshamed. And if you're an ally, just a short video. Hi, my name is, and I support youth with mental health disabilities, and send it to us. Ty Herndon, that famous country star, just did one for us, but there are also Congress people, everyone. We want to make it a national campaign. So please join us, benderleadership.org. But there's another problem, bullying. Kids with disabilities are bullied more than any other group, which leads to these mental health disabilities, anxiety across the board. There was a young boy, 10 years old, African-American, who had a colostomy. And when he would go to school, they would make fun of him, say he smells all the time. And his mother tried everything at the school and she could not get it to stop. And he took his life, 10 years old. Another young girl, African-American, with autism, when she would go to school, they would call her the N-word. Then after that, they would tell her she smelled. One day her mother sees her going to school with Febreze. She said, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm taking it because my chair must smell." She took her life. And then there are tons of, I'm sorry to say that, but there are so many people that I lost. A close young man I thought I had helped, Sam Miller, and Sam died 10 years ago. He took his life. He had depression. That's one of the people that impacted Mary. So all of this together, social media, everything contributes. Isolation, so much.
we have an election coming up in 2 weeks. I know you serve as the vice chair of the board of the American Association of People with Disabilities. Political participation is a key piece of the puzzle for AAPD. Can you talk a little bit about what AAPD is doing around voting with its Rev Up campaign and things of that kind?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we started a Rev Up right here in Pennsylvania. Rev Up, register, educate, vote. So what we're doing is sending out our troops to get people registered to vote. And we're making sure also about the ability to get there. Like we have a number, phone number we give them if you have a problem with transportation, if you have a problem with accessibility, whatever it is, you call that number. And we have people from Disability Rights Pennsylvania ready to go to help. And I mean, we're going everywhere, including skilled nursing. Justin Dart, the great general of the Americans with Disabilities Act, who had polio and used a wheelchair, he would say, vote as if your life depends upon it, because it does.
Yes, it does, yeah.
And I always tell people, look, you see in other elections how small of a percentage, won elections. So that disability vote is so important. So if you want to know more about that, aapd.com.
And you'll find there's a voter research center there on the AAPD website. We're gonna turn to some questions from those who are gathered in a moment, but before we do, I just have one more question for you, Joyce. As you reflect on your work and the progress that has been made through the disability rights movement, what concerns you and what gives you hope for the future?
Well, what gives me hope is that the ship has started turning. Yes, it's a big ship, so it's turning very slowly, but it is starting to turn. We're starting to get, some attention from things like the Accenture report and the ESG, investors saying, hey, what are you doing with disability?
Right.
There isn't anything worse that when CEOs, or I should say chairs of the board, find out that they may have a problem with investors. So that's another thing Ted did, is it started with the comptroller of New York, Tom DiNapoli, who's over $260 billion in pension funds, to send a letter out to about 50 CEOs saying, what are you doing with disability? We're looking at your ESG. And it had an impact. So now we have all these CEOs that are signing on. For example, Bank of America. Imagine if you're trying to, build a new building. And Bank of America says, well, let's see what you're doing with disability. So that's why I said the ship is moving. It's moving slowly, but it is moving. So that gives me great hope that will continue on. What is my problem is not hard to figure out. I can't figure out why this is so slow and why it is, it's just exclusion, excluding people with disabilities from the world of work. So that would be my answer.
Thank you. So the first question came early in the time together. We have a question here from Vanya. What do you mean by not counted in the workforce?
I mean,
clarification.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, from like 16 to, I think it's 62 or 65, the percentage of people that are going to the employment office, trying to find employment, that this is a huge group of people. They aren't even looking. How do we know that? Through the unemployment office. And this is a group of people in the United States. That means they're not being hired and they're not participating through surveys, that have done. They're not being hired and or they are not participating. So that's a group of people that's being left out. That's what that means.
And I want to call on my colleague, Jennifer Sanborn. She has a question here about COVID and the workplace for people with disabilities. Jennifer, do you want to share your question? It's a little fuller than that.
Unmute. She's on mute.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, you're muted, Jennifer.
It's not, there we go. Have you got me?
No, wasn't you, I know. Okay.
I had unplugged my headphones and then I got a microphone not detected. So I thought if I didn't plug back in, you might not hear me. Thank you so much, Curtis and Joyce, for this conversation. And my question is really about a contemporary and changing as we speak reality, which is COVID as both a mass disabling event. So when we think about things like long COVID, we're looking at huge numbers of the perhaps previously employed shifting in their relationship to work. And also this kind of endemic phase, we anticipate long-term risk and remote work as a perhaps more normalized reality. So what do you see as, what do you forecast? What do you imagine in the future as we have this significant pandemic moment and how it is shaping the world of work and disability?
That's funny you would be talking about that because presently that is a major disability rights issue. Understanding that people that had long COVID are now members of the disability community. There will be a huge increase to the disability community. And sadly, with that COVID fog, there was an article in the New York Times. COVID fog is an impact to your thinking, not as clear thinking. And they're almost like a cognitive issue. And there have been people that they felt were not doing their job as fast as before that have fired people. So many people have been fired over this long COVID, the way people with traumatic brain injury are frequently left out. So what we're doing is we're working with companies saying, this is a disability. They do get an accommodation. But what I see it becoming bigger and bigger and more problems occurring from that because it will require accommodations as should be given.
Thank you. I am curious to watch along with you. Does it shift? You were speaking earlier of disability as invisible, largely in our society. And I think this has the potential to make it increasingly visible, very visible, impossible to ignore, and how that changes the work of advocacy going forward will be critical. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We have
also there's an impact to the mental health community because of the isolation. There has been a large increase in that disability also.
Absolutely. We have a question from Linda. Do you have any suggestions for someone who is recently disabled for locating resources in their local area to assist with employment or volunteer opportunities? What would you recommend for?
Well, if they are, let's start with your first part. If they're seeking employment, they can go first to their state VR agency that is supposed to be helping people with disabilities, not just find employment, but pay for training and education. So that would be my first thing. But then I wouldn't just do that. I just spoke about this in a conference and I said, you have to get out there and you have to network yourself. You have to go to events like this, what we're having right now. Imagine if someone would be here, that person they're going to say, oh, I'm going to get in touch with Joyce Bender because this is what they do. So I encourage people to go to, whether it's Day of Caring or any type of event, to network and then use LinkedIn. You know, I encourage people to use social media. But that idea about the volunteer work is good because that's how you get in the door. I sometimes tell people, go and tell them you want an internship or you want an apprenticeship, because that's a way to get in the door at the company. But I would absolutely reach out to people that you know in the community and ask them for their help or what ideas they have. I'm meaning, I don't care if it's the pastor, I don't care who it is, I would reach out and ask people for help. And then, of course, there's Bender Consulting Services, benderconsult.com, because we would at least, even if we can't find employment, call the person and give them guidance.
Okay. I want to invite Jonathan Bay, who has posted a question in the chat, to come on and ask that question. It is from the perspective of an investor speaking to companies about disability inclusion. Jonathan?
Sure. Thank you, Curtis. Thank you, Joyce, for speaking with us today. I work for NEI Investments, a responsible investment firm, and we're exploring how we can further disability inclusion within the companies that we have in our holdings. We're like early stages for this. So I have one or two questions to, if you have any thoughts on it. First, I was wondering if you could share what would be a good starting point, or like the best starting point for a company to get started around progressing, you could say disability inclusion or just disability like employment. Where would a company start?
Hire someone. Anytime people ask me this question, I say where the rubber meets the road is employment. Too many companies, they talk about this and they talk about it, but until you make a point of saying, I am going to strategically go out to universities, colleges, disability organizations, and look to hire someone, it won't have any credibility. People with disabilities have to see you have hired someone, because I assure you, there are people already working with you or with your customers that have disabilities. You know, like when I go to a company, oh, Joyce, I'm so glad you're here. Now you can help us hire people with disabilities. And I'll say, oh, but you already have. Yeah, they're working here right now. They have those non-apparent disabilities like epilepsy, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder, MS. I could go on and on, but people are afraid to disclose. So like you, it's so wonderful what you're wanting to do. But if someone sees you hiring someone, it will make a difference. Another thing I suggest, because of my love of high school students with disabilities, it's past now, but every Wednesday in October is Disability Mentoring Day, where high school students with disabilities come on for a day of job shadowing. But you don't have to wait till then. You could go to different school districts and you could tell the transitional coordinators that, hey, you want this opportunity to provide internships to high school students and or college students with disabilities. But one thing you absolutely must do is have a focused hiring plan to bring in people with disabilities. Now, I would suggest training, like bringing someone in to do training for your employers so they know what to say, what not to say, and how to communicate with people with disabilities. Because right off the bat, people make mistakes of what they say, such as, don't worry, we don't say that word disability. We know that's a bad word. We don't say that. Oh, people with disability, they hate that. People in the disability rights community hate that. You know, don't change our label. Who thinks it's bad? Us or you? So, you know, you need that training. But, you know, I think it's really great You could also refer people to AAPD, other organizations, which I'd be happy to get to Curtis, except he probably knows all of them already, so that you could reach out. How can you help? Volunteer work, etc.
Great, thank you so much. And if I can ask one more follow-up, as a company goes down this route, what really does progress look like in your view? Is it hiring? Is it the number of people that they hire, people with disabilities, or is it like the quality of the opportunities? Yeah, how would you assess like what does progress look like?
Okay, well, over the long run, what I would look at is when you employ people, what job categories are they in? And when you employ people, what job are they in? Like I'll call a company and, oh, we want to hire people from you, Joyce. Call center. We want call center. We know you have a high retention, and I want to say, well, why don't you say accounting? We want people in accounting. I mean, there isn't anything wrong with call center. We do work in call centers, but not everyone has to be in call. So that's like job category, but then levels, who are what promoting people, them moving up in the company, them having a career, not a job. And when I go to a company and they even have leaders for this month that are making comments saying, I have a disability and I'm a vice president. Oh, that's so powerful. And right here in Pittsburgh, I went to Sheetz to get gas yesterday. Right on the pump, there's a screen. This is National Disability Employment Awareness Month. You should be including people with this. I couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe my eyes. It was so awesome. So that brings me to those days and the month. I would expect you to be, celebrating that. But the key thing is the hiring people, not just one job category, but seeing them move up into leadership roles or hiring them. Like when you have a vice president position, calling me saying, hey, Joyce, we're looking for a VP of finance. Who do you have? Not all your hires should be entry level. They should be at all levels.
Thank you so much.
We also have it looks like a follow-up question here from Linda Eastlick. Linda, can I ask you to come on and share that question?
Sure, I'll do my best to phrase it well. I'm interested if there have been studies, because I'm aware of the public support system out there, and that as you get more independent, those services decline and sometimes are eliminated. And are you aware of any studies that have been done comparing that low employment status to the individual's need for public assistance and fear of that going away? And it's a very real reason to have that fear. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I can get that information to Curtis for you. What you're saying is so true. Andy Imparato, another disability rights leader, used to say, we are being encouraged not to work. So people on, for example, SSDI, Medicaid, whatever it is, where they need a personal attendant, know that they're not going to get that personal attendant or the services. But that's not all. They're afraid to go up benefits because and start working because they don't know what will it be like after that. So yes, you are correct, and I will get some information to Curtis for you.
Thank you.
Good question.
Go ahead.
I just have a follow-up. Are you aware of any advocacy out there to change that structure at the source, through our political system? Because we are denying ourselves as employers those individuals who bring so much to the table by not watching out for the whole, not looking at the whole picture.
Yes, one of those groups is AAPD, but also Nicole, Curtis knows all these groups. Could you send her those groups, Curtis?
Mhm. Sure.
AAPD, for example, they meet with politicians on the Hill talking about this various thing. That thing, and all the protection and advocacy groups, that thing is talked about more than any other thing in the disability rights community. So, you know, you're like on target.
Well, we're getting close to the hour. And I do want to thank you, Joyce, for a very rich and engaging conversation. It's great to see you again and good to have you here as a part of this justice dialogue.
I love it. And I love that it's called justice. I just want to say one last thing, Curtis.
Sure.
When I go to a church or a synagogue, and they're asking about people with disabilities being leaders, I say, well, let's start with this. God must think differently than we do, because the first person he chose, who wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament, who led the Israelites out of Egypt, had a speech impediment.
Right.
Now think about that. So just wanted to leave you with that thought that Moses had a disability.
Well, thank you for that. I do want to just remind everyone, and we will follow up with some of the links that we discussed, but benderconsult.com is one website you want to take a look at. Also aapd.com. There's a great deal of resources to be shared there. And I would also encourage you to take a look at christiancitizen.us. We do make a commitment to covering these issues and concerns in that digital first publication. So I encourage you to take a look there as well.
And don't forget Disability Matters with Joyce Bender on voiceamerica.com every Tuesday from 2 to 3. But you can hear any of the old shows, which
Online.
many things we talked about on demand at Spotify.
And also, as far as the justice dialogues are concerned, I want to highlight that on November 8th, Election Day, we will have a special call to prayer at 11 a.m. Eastern. It'll be a time of guided prayer and silent prayer. So be on the lookout for announcements with respect to that as well. I think that's it. Joyce, once again, so appreciative of your work and witness and leadership. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
My pleasure, and everyone have a blessed holiday.
You too.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
So long.
You.
Okay.